the balloon and the utility box and weighed them and have precise measurements. Professor Jones has re-examined that, has recalculated it, and based on the accurate information and the accurate weight of this device, we now know that it was not capable of lifting off. In fact, the difference is due to 18-pound discrepancy as to whether this thing would go airborne or not. The original calculations that were provided to us showed the entire contraption weighing 18 pounds less than it actually did. And that 18-pound weight difference is the difference of whether this thing would take flight or not. We also wanted to look closely at the construction of this device. Basically, it's a 1 mil plastic tarps that were taped together and covered with aluminum foil. The utility box, the base of it is a very thin piece of plywood, and the sides of that box are cardboard, all held together with string and duct tape. Certainly we wanted to question whether that was strong enough to support the weight of Falcon. We have that on display in our evidence bay. We will show that to you at the conclusion of this press conference and allow you to get some photographs. We did place 37 pounds weight in there and have suspended it, and it is in fact capable, as bizarre as it sounds, being held together with duct tape. It will in fact support the weight of a 37-year-old boy, or a 37-pound boy, excuse me. I want to recap the events just briefly up to this point. You know, the morning this occurred, it was obviously chaotic. We responded, as a number of other rescue personnel responded, to what we believed was a life-threatening event with a 6-year-old boy's life in jeopardy. We responded in a rescue mode. After the balloon landed and it was determined the boy was not in there and determined that he was not in the house, we went into a body recovery mode. So clearly emotions were running high. At that time, and I've made a big point out of talking about the emotional condition of the family, their body language, their nonverbal communications, everything that we experienced with the family to that point was very consistent and believable. Although certainly a number of people, including the media, including the viewers, were skeptical about this thing. We remained somewhat skeptical, but as I've constantly said, we have to operate on facts and what we can prove as being facts. So, you know, the fact that with the information we had, it was plausible to believe that this event occurred. So we were in a recovery mode. Some of the other things that initially led credibility to this fantastic story was the fact that the Heene family granted us free access to search their house. They granted us complete access to their children to interview independently. After Falcon was found, they didn't even hesitate to allow us to talk to him outside of their presence. All of these things were very suggestive to us that it was in fact a real deal. If somebody was trying to contract or somebody were trying to make something like this up, we certainly would not expect them to give us the access that they did or the level of cooperation. Again, though, after the fact, we have since learned, as many of you have, that these people are actors. Not only have they appeared in several reality television shows and on YouTubes, we have since determined that, in fact, they met together. The way that they met and established their relationship was in acting school in Hollywood. So needless to say, they put on a very good show for us, and we bought it. Again, I don't fault any of our staff for that. Everything appeared very credible. I can also say, for many of you suggested what-if questions and wouldn't you have done things differently if you were a parent. Certainly I would. Certainly we would have. But for all of those questions that you raised, we had also raised them with the family and obtained what we thought were plausible explanations. Certainly not what any of us would have done at the time, but there was a plausible explanation and a rationale that they could give us that would say, okay. It wasn't until the Larry King show where the family was interviewed by Wolf Blitzer that we had the first aha moment, if you would. And you all know what I'm talking about. When he was asked, why didn't you come down? And he said, I believe Mia said, we did it for the show. If you look at the nonverbal responses as well as some of the verbal cues, not only from him, but from the family, from the children, the reaction, it became very clear to us at that point that they were lying. You picked up on it, we picked up on it. From that point, we had to develop a strategy of where do we go from here? How do we get to the bottom of this? Clearly, the only way that we were going to be able to bring this to a successful conclusion is if we got a confession. We could speculate all we want, but we had to get somebody talking and somebody telling us what really happened. We developed a strategy to do that. It's very important during this time that they maintain their trust with us, that we maintained a very good relationship that we had established with the family. We had to say and do things to make sure that they believe that we were on their side still, and try to just maintain that trust so that we could get them in here voluntarily in order to conduct our interview. Obviously, we wanted to conduct an interview and on our turf, in our environment that was more controlled. The obvious goal was to separate them, to interview them separately, hopefully be able to convince them to take a polygraph. Part of the theme of getting them to take a polygraph is this is the only way that they're going to get the media feeding frenzy off of their back. And if they passed a polygraph, that would be great. If they failed a polygraph, that would give us ammunition to use in interrogation, ultimately with the goal of getting a confession. We had hoped to do that on Friday. That was our game plan, was to try to get them voluntarily in here on Friday to do a polygraph examination. However, after watching the media that morning and the obvious distress that the family was under, the fatigue that they were under, had we run a polygraph under those circumstances, the results would be invalid. Okay, so we needed to get them rested before we could do a polygraph that was going to have any validity. That's why we decided not to pursue the investigation that day, but to pursue it the following morning. Mr. Heene voluntarily came in here under the pretext of we were going to return his aircraft to him. But before we could do that, we had a few questions that we needed to ask him and a few issues that we needed to clarify. He consented to come in. So he came in voluntarily. Unbeknownst to him, at the same time, the minute he hit the door here, we had investigators prepared to go to the house and talk to Mrs. Heene and try to gain her cooperation, as well as conduct interviews with her and the children. Again, that was successful. She volunteered to do that, and then she volunteered to come to the sheriff's office for further interviews and leave her kids there. So those interviews were all conducted there. There were interviews conducted here. Excuse me just a minute here. Let me talk about the one thing that you folks aren't going to like. Okay, so you know where we're at to this point. There's a rule in Colorado, and this is for our people that are not from Colorado media, called Rule 3.6 and 3.8. And the district attorney constantly reminds me of these. In fact, he did so again last night. We are not allowed under these rules to talk about the results of any scientific evidence that is presented. We're not allowed to talk about whether, in fact, a polygraph examination was administered. If a polygraph was administered, we're not allowed to say whether it proved truthful or deceptive. And if anybody made any confession, we're not allowed to comment on whether anybody confessed. So that's the status of where we're at. What I will say is that based on the interviews that were done yesterday, we obtained enough probable cause to execute search warrants at the house last evening. What we were looking for in particular were computers that might contain emails, phone records, financial records, any sort of media recordings, videotapes, or CD, any contracts, or any other documents that might relate to a reality television show, or plans to have such a reality television show. Those search warrants were executed last night. At this point, we have not filed charges.